I probably knew from a very early age that I was one of those kids that turned into a woman that was never really going to quite fit in. I'm the first woman that is an entrepreneur in my lineage and has that privilege to work. And I just go, wow, I'm so lucky that I can work. Standing up to your family, is really difficult. I heard somebody say that the moral of the person is not tested when you stand up against your enemies. The moral and who you are is tested when you stand up against your family.
Shivani, thank you very much for joining me on Success Matters. I was introduced to you because you've written a book, and you can see it in the background there, getting your people to step up, through actually one of my other previous guests, Charlotte, who put me in touch with your publisher, who has put me in touch with you. And in our preparation conversation, we had quite a deep conversation around a number of things. So the first thing I wanted to explore with you was really this path that you and I have had set for us, as I suppose from Indian families, this is very kind of common. That path is typically you get educated, you find someone, you settle down, you get married, you get a house, and that's then it, right? That's your path. What was your path like for you, and how did you break free from that path?
Yeah, well, I think even from a very, very early age, Sanjay, I remember, my mum was getting together with some of the women in the street and they were having an afternoon chai. And, each of the women had a daughter, and they went around and each of them said, what do you want to be when you grow up? They asked each of the daughters. There was a teacher, one of the girls, I remember saying she wanted to be a mother. And when it got to me, and I was probably 5 or 6 years of age at this point, but I very clearly remember saying I wanted to be a truck driver. And
Right.
that didn't go down well. I remember mum's sort of face recoiling. I remember the aunties in the streets face recoiling. Until I sort of saw their faces, I just have, always loved big trucks. And I just thought that would be like the coolest job. And so I probably knew, and I didn't know at that age, but I probably knew from a very early age that I was one of those kids and one of those girls, and one of these girls that turned into a woman that was never really going to quite fit in. And, that's been
Right.
a challenge at times, because often I felt like a misfit in my family. I've also felt a misfit in different groups that I've, been in. But at the age of 11, my father, who's a very, very pro supporter of girls' education, wanted to move our family. So my mum and dad and my younger brother and myself to Australia. So we moved from India at a fairly young age. And I remember thinking, wow, this is such a change. I'm the only brown kid in my class. We moved to a really, relatively small country town with only about 30,000 people. But all the pressure was always, we don't have much money to give you. You've got to get your education. And so there was so much pressure on getting educated, getting a great job, and then, as you said, Sanjay, getting married, having kids. But I just noticed that as I started to, go through school, not a lot of, courses excited me in terms of university. And my father, who's a really big inspiration to me and one of my heroes, and my grandfather equally, who I was very close to when he was and since he's passed away, were both engineers. So I thought, I'm going to study engineering. And I remember bringing that up at the dining table. And that was really it was like, why engineering? What about medicine? Like that might be more, for men and women. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, I can't imagine being a doctor. And so, whether it was the career, and then when I got into at the age of about 20, I was still in my engineering university, and I was in my third year. And I remember one night riding my bike home. We lived a few kilometers from the university, and engineering was pretty full days, and so I was starving. And my mum, like all good Indian mums, is an amazing cook. And normally there'd always be 3 or 4 dishes on the table, but this time there was like 15 dishes on the table. And so anyway, I just start pouring food on my plate, and I start, before I can even, chew it, swallowing my food because I was so hungry. And my mum, I remember so clearly, and she said to me, Beta, we have got some very good news for you, and we have advertised your particulars, your CV, into the Indian Down Under, which is unfortunately a Pakistan publication where parents are looking for their children and matrimony. And but we had a
Right.
very good response, 100 over 100 letters. Um, and I've fixed your time to meet with the top families. I was like, look, I remember just stopping eating Sanjay, and I was like, you've done what? And anyway, my mum and I had a massive argument that night. I slammed the door and was like, why can't she just not get me and who I am? And anyway, I didn't meet any of those families. I was very rebellious. And then when I reached, ripe old age of 30, I met Scott, who, is not Indian and very Australian, white, and came from as an only child, grew up as a Catholic, and so even though our backgrounds were very diverse, and we had met, and anyway, the short story is we've now been together for a long time, and it took mum and dad, mum particularly, a long time to come around.
Yeah.
So I always, and then at the age of, just before I'd met Scott, I also decided that corporate life really wasn't for me. And I went traveling through Nepal just after September 11, and Nepal changed my life. I thought Nepal was going to be so similar to India. And,
Right.
I couldn't speak any Nepali, and most of the kids and, people I met couldn't speak much English except hello and thank you. But they invited me into their homes and,
Hmm.
into their huts. And because it was just after September 11, I arrived to this trek for a month, and I was the only one there. Everybody else had cancelled their trip. So the
Right.
cook and the guide and the Sherpa would stop when I wanted to, and get the stove out and cook me a rice and dal, and we would walk for a few more hours. And it was probably the first time in my life I'd been silent. And I remember thinking, what am I doing? Like, I'm in this job, in this big corporate job that I've worked so hard for. I finally got into a pretty senior job. They pay me so much money. I've got shares in the company. I'm in a fairly mediocre relationship at the time. And, what am I doing? My life feels so mediocre. It feels so 5 out of 10. And that trip was very transformational for me. And so I decided at the end of that trip to I came back, and in the first week I resigned from my corporate job, and I
Right.
resigned from my relationship, and that didn't go down well with Indian parents. What are you going to do? I'm like, I think I'm just going to consult for a while. I had enough money in the bank for a couple of years, not on the same income I was at, but enough to survive and do okay. And I thought, well, after 2 years, if it doesn't work, I'll go and find another job. So that's kind of how I started. So I've constantly been breaking molds from a very young
Right.
age. It hasn't been easy, and you would appreciate that with having the same backgrounds. Standing up to your family, is really difficult. I heard somebody say that the moral of the person is not tested when you stand up against your enemies. The moral and who you are is tested when you stand up against your family and friends. And I wish I had learned that earlier, because it's been tested many times.
Yeah. Wow, that's quite such a powerful story there. And I was just in my mind picturing that moment when you sat down to eat, and you're shoveling food into your face because you're so hungry, and mum comes up with this thing that, we've advertised your biodata on on this website or shadi.com or wherever, and oh yes, here's a list of potential suitors for you. It's a kind of typical scenario that's played out in so many Indian families, right? And
It's like
particularly
a
a few years
weird
back.
HR process. Like, it was a HR process of applicants coming in and doing a short list, and it was like, here are the list of candidates. And I think my mum was so shocked when I said no, because she said,
Yeah.
but I didn't get a choice. I met your dad at the engagement. So for her, it took me a long time to understand this, Sanjay, but as I've got older, I've recognized for her, it was such a leap. For her, it was like, I was told to do that. And, here are the top 3 that I'm recommending. And I remember saying to her, what if I don't like any of them? She said, that's the good news. We go to the next 3. So for her, it was such a leap to go, I'm giving you a choice. You get to pick. Whereas I had
Yeah.
swapped swallowing my food at that point. It was choking me. And I was like, what? What did you do? So, I was 19 and I didn't understand her side of it at that time.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a good point, right? That in her shoes, she felt she was giving you choice, right? She was giving you choice of suitors, at least, if nothing else. Whereas for you, it's like, hang on, mum, yeah, you haven't given me proper choice. Yeah, the freedom to go and choose my own. And so I suppose an important lesson in that is, think about the other person's context when you're thinking about, right, through its reaction to something. And so your trip to Nepal was, I mean, you were the only person there, right, in terms of this particular group, because you were the only one who arrived. And so you had the guide and the cooks and the porters all to yourself. Did you get much chance to interact with them specifically as well? And this was part of that learning of yours, the interaction you had with these people who were living in Nepal?
Yeah, I did. And there's a connection piece that I have with Nepal that it's hard to describe. I remember my Sherpa saying to me, he said, Shivani, if there are things you want from the mountains, the mountains speak to you, and so you can ask the mountains for things. And I remember at the time thinking, okay, this sounds not quite right. But
Yes.
I want announce it to the mountain, leave within the mountains what it is that you want. And so I remember this one particular day, they kind of stayed behind and let me walk up and yell out into the mountains. And I remember yelling out into the mountains that I wanted to do work that was meaningful. I wanted to find somebody who could love me and I could love for till I passed. I wanted to I was in my late 20s at the time, and a number of my, Indian friends had got married, but, Aussie friends had partners and were getting married. And a couple of them had children, and I really had this desire to be a mum. And I remember thinking, okay, that was weird, but now I've shouted that into the mountains and, left that there. And so these people were, they were so grateful that I had come to the trip. They were so grateful to do the trip, even though I knew that, I'm not sure how many people were booked. I think 15 or so people originally. And the fact that they were now going to get maybe potentially one lot of tip rather than, from 15 people, they were so grateful to do their work and have the opportunity, because their work was being cancelled all the time. And, many of us experienced that through COVID a few years ago too. And so I just found how humbling they were. I found Nepal and, little kids I would particularly meet. I love meeting kids, but I love meeting people from different cultures. And, they would just interact with me and start a conversation with me, even though they didn't really understand. And I remember, this one particular story, Sanjay, that somebody had said to me, like, kids in Nepal love lollipops, or kids universally love lollipops. So in my backpack every day, I would carry this bag of lollipops. And anytime we under a tree in a village and kids would run up and they'd go, hello. And that's often the only word of English they knew. So I'd go, yeah, you can tell, or she can tell that I'm a tourist. So I'd unpack my backpack and give them a little lollipop. And there's this little boy ran up. He was so beautiful. He was about 5 years of age and this beautiful, beautiful face. And he runs up and he goes, hello. And I was just sitting under a tree. We had just been walking for a few hours. So I went, yeah, he knows I'm a tourist. So I unpacked my backpack and I gave him the lollipop. But he didn't run away. He just sat there, like with his, face in his hand, awkwardly staring at me and smiling. And then a couple of minutes later, this little girl ran up, and she was about 3.5. And as she got closer to me, I realized that she had the same features as him. And I thought, oh, maybe that's his little sister. And I thought, she'll probably want a lollipop. So I was just about to unpack my backpack and give her a lollipop. But I didn't even get a chance to unpack my backpack. He bit his lollipop and he gave her half of it. And and he just wrapped it up back in the wrapper and put it in his pocket. And I remember that single moment thinking, why is he so happy? Like, he looks like he has nothing. He's got no shoes and he's got worn out clothes. And I remember thinking, he looks at me as if I've just given him $1 million. And I thought, I have so much and I feel like I have so little. And he seems to have everything. And I remember thinking, I want what you have. And that was a really shifting moment for me. Like, I remember being silent a lot after that moment that day and just walking. And so quite hard to explain in words, but it was such a transformational place for me to kind of a bit of self-discovery, really. And I know travel can do
Yeah.
that. Travel by myself, which was the first time I'd ever traveled by myself, but not that that was planned. But then to actually have hours and hours of just walking in nature and going, wow, who am I? And what do I like? What am I not enjoying? And what am I going to make changes in? It was really extraordinary. And if I hadn't done that trip, I probably still have been stuck somewhere in a corporate job, married to an Indian guy.
Yeah. It is the power of transformation from travel is pretty immense, really. And I had a not as deep an experience as you, but we went to Bali a few years ago, and we were doing a little cycle tour through Bali from the top of the hills down into the valley, and we stopped at a school, and the kids came running out to greet us, and we knew we were going to stop at a school, so we had like biscuits and stuff to give to them, snacks and what have you. And very similar to yours, there were kids who just took it, and then they straight away started sharing with the other kids. No, it wasn't that kind of selfishness that, no, this is mine and whatever. And then for me, the moment that kind of really struck me in my heart was the head teacher was asking our guide, where are these guys from, whatever, and he said, they're from the UK. And she said to him, are they Hindu? And he said, yes, they are. So she started to recite the Gayatri Mantra, which is, our kind of Lord's Prayer in effect. And so I felt under pressure because, like, you put on the spot, you know it inside you, but you got to kind of like repeat it. So I started repeating it, but then all the kids joined in, and the kids joined in with so much fervor and so much like, really passionate that moment there, I just filled up with tears in my eyes because it was just so powerful. That's just that moment in itself. So I can see how that experience you had in Nepal could be really, really life-changing, really make you think about where your life is and what you're doing, particularly at the age that you were at the time, which was, late 20s. If we fast forward now to a different part of the world, which is Necker Island, which is probably a complete contrast to your experience in Nepal, you went to Necker Island and you actually met Richard Branson there.
Yeah, I did. That was on the bucket list. I do a vision board every year, Sanjay, for the last 20 years. And that was on my vision board for 14 years. Richard Branson's books, it was one of the first business books I read when I stepped into business, 20 years ago. And I just thought he was so out there and, pretty amazing at building brands and some of the work that he's done. So for 14 years, there was a little corner of my, vision board that is saying Necker Island / Richard Branson on it. And then I finally had the opportunity to go. And, it's from Australia, anywhere is far because we live so far away. But Necker Island is not the easiest place to get to. There were 4 planes and a boat ride. And after almost 36 hours of travel, I get there. And I remember when I arrived,
Right.
I'm so tired. It was late in the afternoon. And I thought, to get my body clock, in line to Necker, let me just stay up till about 9 p.m. And then I'll go to bed and then I'll, catch up on my sleep and get into the Necker clock. And I remember meeting one of the young men who was working at the bar and said, I feel so tired, but I have to stay up till dinner. And he said, well, there's a couple of really good spots on the island for sunsets. And why don't you, go and have a shower, come back, and I'll make you a cocktail, mocktail, whatever you like, and I'll meet you there. I said, great. So I, had a shower. I was just sitting there. It might have been a few minutes. And Richard Branson walks up and he says, can I take a seat? It's like, oh my God. I didn't think he was like wandering around, and obviously it's his island. He can do what he likes. And that conversation in the next few minutes, again, Sanjay, was one of those transformational moments. I had just exited a couple of businesses, a wellness business and a co-working space business. I'd been running them both for over a decade. I didn't love running them, but I stepped into them because at the time, my husband's was a corporate job. We had 2 little kids who were 2 and 3. And, as a speaker and coach, I was finding myself traveling a lot. And I thought, well, this is crazy. Like, we've got nannies in our home, 9 to 5 and sometimes staying overnight. This is crazy. And so I thought I'd step into these other businesses because they were local businesses and I could grow them and that would limit some of my travel. So I sort of did it more for the family at that point. Didn't love running them, but was able to learn a lot and grow them. And I had just exited and I was in this space again. almost 20 years later of not knowing, a bit like Nepal, and, not knowing, what I was going to be doing next, I forced myself to have a 6-month sabbatical, which a lot of my colleagues had done after exiting businesses. They suggested that it wasn't a great idea to step into something. So I got to Necker in my sabbatical, and, I was dreading the question, so what do you do? Right? And so of all people in the world, Richard Branson says, so what do you do? And I said, well, stumbling across it, well, I was running these businesses and now I'm forcing myself into a sabbatical and I'm trying to work out the next path, Richard. And he said to me, sometimes people say to me, well, you're a billionaire, Richard, you can do anything you like. But I've always done stuff I'm really passionate about, really enjoy. And, whether it's music, whether it's flying, and then I'm always trying to make a business out of something that I really enjoy rather than the other way around. And again, that was such a profound conversation for me because at this point, I'd already been approached by somebody to maybe look into a business partnership with them. And I'd said, I'm going to pause that till the end of my sabbatical. And it felt like this complete circle from 20 years ago of leaving corporate. And I thought, what do I really, really, really want to do? And I thought, it's the same thing I wanted to do when I left corporate. It was having an opportunity to, have impact on others and doing that through work I love. And I did some further work on that. If there are only 3 things that you're doing, then what would you be doing? Well, I would be speaking and coaching and writing. They're the 3 things I would be doing. So it started to when, okay, I don't know how this works now, now that I've been running other businesses, but I'm going to step back into that world and I'm going to go back and I'm going to set some goals in those 3 areas. And that conversation was such a pivot for me to go, because I'd been running multi-million-dollar businesses at that point that I'd exited. So in my back of my brain was, okay, and my ego was like, okay, now we need to double that, right? So if we got to 5, let's get to 10. If we got 10, let's get to 20. Like that's success. That's the bit where you get that bigger business because now you've built a business to that level. Now you need to double or triple or 10x it. And I thought, no, that this is not the answer at all that came out of that trip. It was doing more stuff that I really, really loved. And I think the timing, as you know, Sanjay, in life is so critical, right? That we have these moments where a couple of my friends, one of my friends had particularly got very ill. And she unfortunately has since passed away. She was only a few years older than mine. Her kids are only a couple of years older than mine. And I think those moments also, having had Jill pass, I also started to just think about, well, you don't really know whether you've got 100 years anymore. And, she just went for a routine checkup and found out she had stage 4 cancer. And wasn't expecting that. Her daughter was still, and, I remember having a flight with her and she said, that's when she told me we were on a plane together coming back to the city we lived in. And she said, I don't know how to prepare for death. I don't know what to do with my daughter. I don't know what to do. And I remember thinking and crying all the way home on that flight and thinking, how do you prepare for death when it just all of a sudden, that's presented to you in a pretty horrific package. And we hear of people passing and we hear of people getting cancer and people passing away very young. But when it happens to somebody close to you, I think the reality hits home a lot more. And, when it happens to a family member or a friend or somebody you're close to, you go, wow, the saying of life is short is really true. And so she left me with many gifts, but one of them was to, constantly do what you love.
Right. Okay. And so, and I'm very sorry to hear about her death. And it is, as you say, when someone close to you, it does have a profound effect on you. You talk a lot in your work about passion and finding your passion. So I can see where this kind of theme has come from. If someone is listening to this podcast, watching the podcast, what would be the first steps that they should take to find their passion? If they're like thinking, I'm not really sure what my passion is or where my interests lie, what should they do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel that passion is a word that's sometimes very misunderstood. To me, if you look at the word passion and you break it down, it says pass I on. So what part of yourself are you going to pass I on? And so what piece of yourself do you want to pass on? And, my experience is also, having spoken about this in many parts of the world, is that a lot of people are still living other people's passions. So, whether it's their parents or their siblings or their partners or even their children's, and, we're trying to do things to fit that in. I know that when I made that decision to step into running other businesses, it moved me away from my deeper passion because I put family first. And not to
Yeah.
say that was right or wrong, but that was my really big lesson out of that when I put my family ahead of my own passions, that it didn't actually leave me in a very happy place. So one of the things I say is it's so important in the model that I share, and the model that I share in the book. It talks about the fact that we can look at lots of areas, but essentially there are 7 areas, and we can't do all of them. If you want to really master something, you need to pick 3. So the first step is to understand the 7 and pick the 3 consciously for what you want. And I always set them, that's the next year. It doesn't have to be for the rest of my life. For the next 12 months, what do I really want to master? I then suggest to people, Sanjay, that they set their goals after they've set their passions. So a lot of people I know set goals, but if your passions are not in alignment with your goals, then
Yeah.
you hit some goals and you'll miss some goals. Whereas when you get really clear, these are the 3 things that I want to really master, and the other 4 areas you still have to do. For example, if money is in your bottom 4, you still have to pay the bills and do what you need to do, but it won't be an area that you try and master. So it also takes that guilt away that we don't have to be good at everything. We want to choose what we want to master. And then I say, write 5 goals for each of your top 3 passions. So you end up with 15 goals just on the top 3, and then you might have 2 or 3 for the other areas. So you end up with a bunch of goals. And then if you're visual, I create a vision board. I go onto just a free or a cheap app, and I just pick images that represent those goals to me. They don't mean anything to anybody else. And the idea is there to look at that vision board all the time. I look at mine 2 or 3 times a day. Mine's on my, screen that I'm speaking to you on. It's on my phone. It's where I get changed in my cupboard. But it's constantly in my face. That is reminding me to have a look at that and say, hey, what are you creating today? What are you creating, this week? But the other thing I say to people around passion is that, passion is not just this fluffy thing. That, passion without discipline is a waste of time. So passion without discipline is a waste of time. So, once you've got those passions clear, you actually have to be really disciplined about creating rituals and actions and habits that actually help you live those, top 3 out specifically. And you want to say no to a lot of things that are not in your top 3 and yes to a lot of things that are in your top 3. So I always say it's passion and discipline, not passion by itself.
Right. Yeah. And I suppose passion, when you say discipline, it is also the discipline to take action against that, right? So it's not just something you've put on paper, put on your vision board. You now have to do something towards that. Otherwise, it's just going to sit there and not really make a transformation to your life, right?
That's right. And, very rarely does that happen. But what you then start to do is you start to see more results in your life. Because what you realize is that the things you're craving or the things that you really want to master, you start dedicating yourself more towards those rather than things that, for the next year aren't in your top 3. And so it also allows you to say no to a few things. And, when I created that model, I went, okay, wow, like now I need to be able to say, which I now do say without guilt, that my work is my number 1 passion. And, I've explained that to my husband and kids. And it's not because I don't love you and I wouldn't take a bullet for you, but I feel like, I'm not put on the planet just to work, but the impact of the work is really important in terms of what I do. And so if I can be at work and not feel guilty, we're recording this podcast really early, my time, really late your time, Sanjay, for example. And, it's a pleasure getting up super early and doing something that somebody might hear that has an impact on what they do. And I would do anything for my family, and they're a very close second, but it took me a long time as a woman and as an ethnic woman to be able to say, my work is really important to me and I need to be really dedicated to it. I don't want to work 80-hour weeks anymore. So I'm very clear about productivity and how I keep it in a very clear boundary in terms of the hours I work. But that work is really important. And people say to me, when are you going to retire? I said, I'm not going to retire. I plan to work hopefully till the week that I die, whether it's, paid work, whether it's volunteer work. And so I don't plan to stop. That's not, because for me, work is such a privilege. A lot of people go, oh my God, I go to work. I go, like I'm the first woman in my lineage to work. My mum has a
Yeah.
degree. She has never worked. My grandma, my aunties, I'm the first woman that is an entrepreneur in my lineage and has that privilege to work. And I just go, wow, I'm so lucky that I can work rather than, and the choices that it gives me compared to not being able to.
I think what you said about passion and pass I on is so powerful a statement, because now that you found your why in effect, right, and what you're going to pass on, work doesn't feel like work, right? It's something that is a joy, as you say. It's something that you want to do, and you can visualize yourself doing it until, as you say, the week you die. Because it's not work, it doesn't feel like work, so you don't necessarily need to retire from that. So I really like that pass I on. I'm going to borrow that from you, if I may. It's a great way of looking at things. As you know, this podcast series is called Success Matters, and you've been on quite a journey through your life. What does success mean to you now?
That's such a good question, so Joe, because it always felt like the carrot dangling in front of me, success. When I was younger, it was to be able to choose my career, then it was to choose my soulmate, then it was like if I become a mum, then I'll be really happy. Then if I started up my business, I'll be really happy. Then it was if I exit my business for a great valuation, then I'll be really happy. And yes, each of those brings me lots of happiness and joys, but really it didn't make me feel super successful. And so I think success today, and this might change again in a decade, but success today to me means doing something beyond self. Yes, I want to impact work. I want to travel. I love traveling. I want to earn great money. I want to really support my kids as they're getting a great education and, move into the world and doing their own thing. But, how do I actually, really started to play with this word of success and legacy and how are they interlinked a bit. And, it's not about creating something huge, but, for somebody, I experienced some sexual abuse as a child. And this only
Right.
came to light as I got into my 20s and into my 30s. And I'm a big believer that everything happens for a reason, and that's not to justify the abuse in any way. But I started to go, well, why me? And why was I meant to experience it? But what am I meant to do with it? One thing that it's happened in my past, but what am I meant to do with it? Because there must be a reason. And, that's when I had an aha moment and I went, okay, I'm meant to help educate girls in rural villages and third world countries that would otherwise live life off abuse, be married off very early, even at the age of 11 or 12, and never have that opportunity to be able to work and never have the opportunities that I had to be able to, that I was gifted in so many ways. And so I went, okay, I'm not sure how exactly to do that, to be honest, but it feels like that if I can spend the next decade or the rest of my life doing elements of that, and as I get older, maybe more and more of that, that would be a super cool way to feel like I'd had a really successful life. And at the same time, it's not about all being altruistic. But, that whole all material world and business, building businesses to X, Y, Z $1 million also just felt a bit hollow, or the corporate world by itself felt a bit hollow. So I'm trying to find that medium of, materialistic and altruism and find somewhere in between that I can land. But I think as I get older, I'll move more towards the altruism side. And I think that feels a bit more like success today. Not sure if I've answered that question, but I'm trying to work
No,
that out.
you have.
I'm moving on the continuum a bit.
Yes, I think you're right. I think the continuum, it is continuum, and it changes at different phases of your life and different stages of your life. And sometimes that's because of the circumstances you're in, right? So, you're young, you've got a young family, you're getting a nice place to live for your family to grow. That for you is success at that time. But then a different phase in your life, it could be something completely different. So I think you're right. There is a continuum, and there's that balance between the materialistic and altruistic that kind of plays out as part of that. And I know on our preparation call, you said that on your vision board, you've got this vision of educating 1 million girls in India and developing countries. So that's clearly something you're going to be focusing on and being very passionate about. So, and it's a very important thing, as you say, to educate the girls so that they can make choices and have a life of their own, in whatever context that may look like, is so important. So I take my hat off to you for setting that up as a goal and a target for yourself.
Yeah, I set myself stupidly, ridiculous goals because I think, if I set a goal of 1 million, then, if we get to 760,000, well, awesome, right? So
Yeah.
I always say, set crazy goals. And even if you don't quite reach it, that number will propel you towards sort of doing something a bit bigger than you, initially imagined.
Yeah, exactly. Audacious goals are the ones, right? It goes back to shoot for the stars and land on the moon type of thing.
I
You've
love
still
that.
made it to the moon, which is really great. So a tradition I have, which I've borrowed from another podcast series, is I ask a previous guest for a question to ask for my next guest. So my previous guest asked, I shall read it out for you. And then you may have actually answered this during the process of our conversation. So let's see. What would you do differently if you weren't concerned about other people's opinions?
Yeah, and that could be such a long answer, Sanjay. So many things. Probably one thing was that I would have, in our conversation, it sounds like I've always backed myself, but I haven't always. There were
Right.
times my self-belief or lack of self-belief got in the way, and then I spent so long staying in that, whether it was a relationship or a job or a business. And so if I was doing things differently, I would believe in myself more. And I think I would have made some of those decisions faster, rather than taking sometimes months or years to make.
And was it the concern of other people's opinions that meant that you weren't making those
Opinions,
decisions
but also
yourself?
not wanting to, hurt people. I remember,
Right.
even, being in that really mediocre relationship, I knew it wasn't right in the first year. But I stayed in it thinking, well, I fought my mum, to be in this relationship. And so I can't admit defeat. So there was ego in that. And then there was the,
Right.
not this other person's fault that I've stepped into a relationship. I knew it wasn't right from the beginning. And, I don't want to hurt them, but I knew it wasn't right. And it wasn't until that trip to Nepal I went, actually, it's not about me stepping out of that relationship. I'm also doing a disservice to him by staying in this relationship because I'm not present in it. This isn't the right relationship for me. And, I'm also doing a disservice to my job and my colleagues and my boss who believes in me so much by staying in this role because my heart is not in it. And so I sometimes stayed in it thinking I should. And other times I stayed in it because I was too scared to make a decision.
Right.
Just wasn't brave enough.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. So do you have a question for my next guest?
Oh, so many questions. If you could spend your life being dedicated to something, what would that be?
Okay. If you could spend your life being dedicated to something, what would that be? Okay. And I'm assuming for you, again, back to that continuum, it's kind of changed as you've gone along, and probably when your kids were very young, that was where you were dedicating your time. But now your kids are a bit older, they're a bit more independent, and your focus has shifted. Is that a fair assumption to make?
Yeah, absolutely. And, my kids are 15 and 14 now. So, Jane, it wasn't until last year that I actually shared with them my story of my childhood abuse. And
Right.
I felt that it was the right time for them. And, obviously they're getting quite a bit of those conversations happening in their high schools as well. And, it was such a beautiful moment. I mean, they both cried and they both, my daughter said to me, she said, now I understand. Now I understand. I always thought you were just this overprotective Indian mother. And
Right.
now I get why. And I understand. And that's really deepened. We have always had a really beautiful connection, but it's really deepened that. And, the question I've asked both of them is, and I said, look, I actually don't want to be one of those Indian parents. Your dad's Aussie who ends up being more Indian than me, Sanjay, but that's for another day. I always say that I'm the more Australian parent. Scott loves everything Indian. He's built a temple and he's vegetarian, and he's named our kids Om and Shanti, so he's pretty Indian.
All right.
And
Okay.
he's really in with the family now. But But it's been a great conversation to have with them, with the kids, to say, well, what do you want to do? Like, what problem do you want to solve? And I don't really mind what problem you solve. I don't really mind what you study, but it would be so great if you could find a problem that you are passionate about, that you want to solve, whether it's climate change or saving animals or whatever it is. Just find something you really care about and then study something about that, rather than there's no expectations from us at all. So,
yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's really, really, really important to give them that freedom to find their space. And I really like the approach you've taken. What problem would you like to solve? Because then that goes back to their passion, right? And goes back to what would be of interest to them, rather than what we grew up with, which was you had your choices: doctor, engineer, accountant, lawyer. That was pretty much the path that was expected to be taken.
Sanjay,
So
you got
kind of
lawyer.
come full circle in the conversation.
I didn't get any lawyer offers. I would have taken.
Yeah. Although, to be fair to my parents, they didn't really push me down one particular path. But given my brother's a doctor, the other brother studied engineering, the other brother studied finance, you can kind of see where it was going with my own family. So, yeah, we're kind of at the top of our time now, Shivani. It's been a really, really great conversation. If people want to find out more, or if they want to get in contact with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, the best way is to go to my website, which is called askshivani.com. As the website says, ask any questions. My handle on LinkedIn is the same. It's Ask Shivani, and on Instagram and on Facebook. So, yeah, any questions, please shout out. But Ask Shivani, and love to connect with you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for getting up early in the morning. I know you do get up at this time, but you've kind of changed your routine somewhat to be able to record this. So thanks very much for that. I really do appreciate it. And I've really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. Thanks for having me on.
To find your success, contact me at info@successmatterscoaching.com. That's info@successmatterscoaching.com.